Yeah, and so, a number of things. Christina went through and we said, hey, we can just put pins in all the backs of the seats now. So you'll have that. If you want to write during Sunday school and take notes, or like during the service with the gospel lesson, you can fill that out. Because you'll have a pen in front of you, and your welcome slip. That'll be fine too. This slide. Let me. You have the remote. Other remote.
Sure.
Yeah, great. Let me try something here. Thanks everybody for your patience, just being here the first time and all. This is a dark theme here. The rest are more visible, but I'm going to try to do something here. Is that getting better for you? Okay. I'm going to lighten this, and then we'll shade it back.
So Francis.
What's that?
Lighten up, Francis.
Yeah.
Is that Full Metal Jacket?
Stripes.
All right. So, looking at as we've been going through each book of Scripture so far, where do we start out? Where do we start out in the book of Genesis?
Creation, Adam and Eve.
Yeah, so we got creation and Adam and Eve. That's where we start, and then Genesis ends with whom and where? Yeah, Joseph in Egypt. So, and how many chapters do we have in Genesis? Bonus points here. 50, yeah. So easy, Genesis 50. Okay, and then we talked about as well. Exodus next. And where do we start with Exodus? Who are we starting with?
Moses.
Yeah, we're starting with Moses. And when is Moses born in Exodus?
Chapter 2.
Yeah, chapter 2. So Moses is there in chapter 2, being born. What's going on in chapter 1 when Exodus opens?
Slavery.
Yeah, they've been enslaved because there was a Pharaoh who didn't know whom? Didn't know Joseph. He enslaves the people, becomes afraid of them. And so what's Pharaoh doing in chapter 1? Yeah, killing all the male babies. And so Moses is born. That's why they have to hide him. So we got in chapter 1 the slaughter of babies. Where do we see that pattern again? Herod. Yeah, Herod and Jesus. Okay, so you've got the slaughter of babies and Jesus escaping, the deliverer, Jesus escaping the evil ruler, Herod, who's killing all the male children in Bethlehem. And okay, so where does Exodus end? What's going on at the very end of Exodus? Tabernacle. Yeah. What about the tabernacle?
It was built exactly.
Yeah, it was built exactly. So it's completed. God fills the tabernacle with His presence. Glory cloud. That's the end of Exodus. Okay, it literally ends on that. The tabernacle's built. Moses examines it. He finds it to be exactly the way that it was supposed to be, and God fills the tabernacle. And so, what's our chapter? What's our chapter there? How many chapters in Exodus? 40. Okay. So, another nice even number for us. Whoop. That's nice. So tabernacle completion is chapter 40. And so we got a lot of stuff going on in Exodus. Name some things that are going on. First of all, with Moses, what happens to him, like chapter 3?
Burning bush.
Yeah, burning bush. And so where is he with the burning bush? Midian. So all that stuff that we have from Charlton Heston, the bulk of the movie, is really just in that chapter 2. And a lot of that's just created there. But so Moses goes to Midian. How long is he there in Midian? 40 years. How long was he in Egypt before he left for Midian?
40 years.
40 years. And then after Exodus, how long is he in the wilderness?
40 years.
40 years. Okay, he dies at 120. So we've got 10 plagues. When's our 10th plague? What chapter are we in? It's a good biblical number.
7.
Almost.
3.
Think eggs.
12.
12. There you go. Okay. So 12 is Passover, which is the 10th plague. So they exit there, and then when do they arrive at Sinai? Okay, 19. Yeah, chapter, sorry. Okay, so there's your basic structure for Exodus. You got Moses up here. He's in Midian, burning bushes, chapter 3. But he goes back. You got the 10 plagues ending with chapter 12. Okay, and they're traveling to Sinai. They get there at 19, and then 19 to 40 is law and tabernacle completion, construction. Okay. All right. Now let's go on to Exodus now. To Leviticus now. And Leviticus, you took a pre-quiz on it last week. Describe Leviticus in terms of what kind of content's in there. What kind of book is Leviticus? What's it about?
Law.
Okay, what kind of law? Law about what?
Ceremonial.
Yeah, ceremonial law. So when we talk about ceremonial law, what are we talking about? What kinds of law? So in Leviticus, what we're saying is it's not the moral law. It's not the judicial law. What's an example of moral law that we have in the books of Moses, the first 5 books?
Don't murder.
Don't murder. Moral law is personal law that applies to you today as a Christian. Okay? Don't murder, don't steal, don't kidnap somebody, don't commit adultery, love your neighbors, you love yourself, that kind of thing. Although that little one's in Leviticus. But in Leviticus, you've got ceremonial law. Ceremonial law is dealing with what? Sacrifices.
Temple stuff.
Festivals, yeah. Festivals, sacrifices. Good. And what kind of persons are addressed a lot?
Priests.
Yeah, priests and Levites, hence the name, Leviticus. Okay? And so this is a book where we don't have, there's no travel. There's no real narrative in Leviticus. It's a listing of laws about tabernacle stuff, priests, sacrifices, festivals that they have. Okay, good. All right, let's start clearing the back with Mr. Sleepy. Bo is working into the AM, and he's here. All right, Mo. I looked down at Moses, and I looked at you, and I combined them. Would you read this slide for us, the whole thing?
Leviticus, author, date, Moses, writing after the construction of the tabernacle.
Okay. So that's what's going on. And so we got Moses writing this. How many books does Moses write? 5 books, yeah. Genesis to Deuteronomy. And what did we say about our writing date for Genesis? When was Moses writing that? Most likely.
1410.
No.
Oh,
Before they went
Close. That's a good date. What's that?
Before they went into the promised land?
Yes. Where is he?
Oh, right outside the promised land. On the
Sinai. Okay, Sinai. The purpose of Genesis is to get God's people not going back to Egypt and to get them into the promised land. And we have nothing in the book of Genesis that indicates any kind of, it ends with Joseph. So we have no event that's recorded in there that requires us to take a date like that's in the wilderness wanderings or edge of the promised land, that kind of thing. But when you read Genesis, you see this is Moses getting the people to not go back to Egypt, which he shows to be a very evil place throughout Genesis, and to go into the promised land, which is prefigured in a lot of ways in Genesis. Okay, so our writing date for Genesis is Mount Sinai. Okay, what did we say for a writing date for Exodus? And this has to do with things that Moses says in a couple of places in Exodus that indicate what the writing date had to be. Andrew.
1410.
1410. What's 1410?
40 years after 1450.
Yes, 40 years after 1450. So roughly they're at Mount Sinai at 1450. Okay, they've come out around 1450. 40 years after 1450 is 1410. What have they been doing for 40 years? Wandering the wilderness. Why do we say Exodus was written after the wilderness wanderings?
Because it said they've been wandering for all this time.
Yeah, with chapter 16 and chapter 39, maybe, it says that God provided manna for the people, chapter 16, for all 40 years they were wandering in the wilderness. Okay, that's a conclusive statement looking at past events. Okay, so that helps date the book for us. This is Moses writing at the end of the 40 years. And it also says that the chapter, I think it's chapter 40, the cloud led them along in the wilderness for all of their travels. Okay, so Moses gives us those two statements there in Exodus that show us that he's not writing before their wilderness wanderings are over, but after. And so Exodus is getting them to, as we talked about last week and the week before, helping them understand what about Moses and his laws. What should the people who are at 1410, Moses is about to die, Joshua is about to take over, what is Moses teaching them in the book of Exodus? That's the purpose statement of Exodus.
Moses and the law that God gave him are good for them.
Yeah, keep following Moses and his law, even though Moses will not be there to supervise you doing that. Okay? And so you see all through Exodus, Moses' authority is being underlined. Okay? Moses says, I don't want to do this. And God says, I will not have anyone else do this but you. Moses is trying to get out of it. Moses doesn't want the fame, the glory, the attention. And God says, no, it's you. And God tells Moses, I'll appear in thunder and cloud on Sinai so the people will fear you and follow your ways. And so Exodus is written for those on the edge of the promised land so that they know their blessing in the promised land is dependent upon the degree to which they follow God's laws, which were delivered through Moses. Okay? I know I'm just getting you into, as we'll do this with each book, into the mindset of the Bible was not written to you. And if you take it as written to you first, you will misinterpret it. Right? Facile imitation equals misinterpretation. Right? If you just simplistically, apply Exodus, you're going to build a tabernacle and start killing bulls. Okay, so you know that. I'm just getting you to follow through with that and to say, okay, what was God writing to the people when he wrote it? What was his reason for writing? And so they're on the edge of the promised land, and he's showing them, which we'll see in the rest of the history of God's people in the Old Testament, he's showing them, if you don't follow the laws of Moses, you'll experience curse. Okay? If you don't follow my worship regulations, Exodus chapter 32, what's in Exodus 32? If you don't follow my worship regulations, golden calf. Very good. Thank you, Chase. So yeah, this will happen to you. I will want to extinguish you as a people, and you'll need Moses as your intercessor, begging me not to extinguish you. And so God is doing this. And so read Exodus with that in mind. This is God giving a covenant authority, authorization to Moses and his whole order of how God's people live. Okay? Now we get to Exodus. And Exodus, so Exodus is maybe written Leviticus. Keep doing that. Leviticus is written maybe and probably before Exodus. It could possibly be written before they leave Mount Sinai. The only narrative we really have in Leviticus is Nadab and Abihu in chapter 10. And they are sons of Aaron who don't follow the worship regulations. They offer up strange fire. That is, there's a specific formula of ingredients that you put in the incense that you burn at the golden altar before the Holy of Holies. And they go in there and burn strange fire. And anyone remember what God does with Nadab and Abihu? Yeah, he kills them. And so they drop dead right there. That's the only narrative we have in Leviticus. It could have happened, and that they're at Mount Sinai, I think, for about a month after the law of God. Moses comes down with the law of God before they leave, maybe a couple of weeks. So that could have happened there, but most likely that happened sometime during the wilderness wanderings. And so since Leviticus has that written in it as past tense history, Nadab and Abihu offered strange fire to the Lord and were killed. The book of Leviticus needs to be written after that, so that could be written of as history, as Moses writes it as history. So Leviticus, I put a soft date on there, probably during the wilderness wanderings, maybe as late as on the edge of the promised land. Maybe he writes it right before or after Exodus. But we don't build a church over that. But we just know our last recorded event in Leviticus is Nadab and Abihu's death. And if we take their offering strange fire as really quick after they got ordained, then we can be at Mount Sinai. But probably it occurred when they got used to what they were doing, and it was old hat, and they weren't reading the instruction book anymore. And felt kind of cocky, and so they went in there just offered incense that wasn't God's prescribed incense. Okay, so a writing after the construction of the tabernacle, but before Moses' death, obviously. So late date of 1410, which would be Moses' death. Early date of 1450, which would be Mount Sinai sometime. 1448, we'd say. They were at Mount Sinai about 2 years. Or they left Mount Sinai 2 years after leaving. Okay. Content. Joyce, would you read this for us?
You shall bring your offering of animals from the herd or the flock.
Okay. So like we talked about, Leviticus is about this kind of stuff. Jeff, can you read this?
What's in this book? Generally, it's a book of regulations for...
Okay, you name these things. Regulations for what? You named these already. Just say them again. Sacrifices. Festivals. Good. What's that?
Worship.
worship, which is in the sacrament. Yeah, those two things. And what kind of persons? Regulations for whom? Priests and Levites. Okay, Levites and priests. What's the difference between priests and Levites?
Priests are selected from the Levites as special servants within the Levites to serve in the tabernacle.
Okay, good. So, could you be a priest if you weren't a Levite?
No.
No. Yeah. So, no, Levite. Why the name? Why are they called Levites?
Sons of Levi.
Sons of Levi. And who was Levi?
One of the 12 sons.
One of the 12 sons of
Jacob.
And he was renamed as what?
Israel.
Israel. Okay, good. We're all just hitting all this stuff, so we get all this content in our heads. And so you couldn't just be a Levite to be a priest. You had to be a Levite descended from the Levite Aaron. And who was Aaron in relation to anyone else?
Moses.
Yeah, Moses' brother. Okay, so Moses' brother Aaron gets the priesthood. And he and his sons are ordained to the priesthood. We'll see that in Leviticus. We see it elsewhere too. And so if you weren't descended from Aaron, no matter how skilled you were at supervising sacrifices, it didn't matter. You had to be descended from Aaron. This is one of the foul balls that is in the book of Judges, when they don't have a king and they're doing whatever they think is right in their own eyes instead of what's right in God's eyes. They just hire out Levites, and to do priestly work and sacrifices, people who aren't descended from Aaron. Or in the divided kingdom up in the north, the northern kingdom, okay, this is after Solomon, in the northern kingdom, they just pull out priests from anybody. People who aren't Levites, and it's one of the reasons the north is cursed. Okay, so regulations. So here we go.
John?
Yeah,
So
Laura.
If you were a Levite and you weren't from the line of Aaron, then what was your job?
You were a Levite. And so, good, thanks for bringing that up. So I wanted to do that, and then I completely forgot. So you've got Israel, who is the man Jacob, and one of his 12 sons is Levi, and then descended from Levi are the awesome three: Moses, Aaron, and their sister Miriam. Yeah. Moses leads, but Aaron is given the priesthood. So, what is Moses?
A Levite.
He's a Levite, yeah. But the priesthood comes from Aaron. And then all the other Levites, for the rest of the history of Israel, are just Levites. But there's a division of labor that is parallel to the division of labor between elders and deacons today in the New Testament. And so when you look at Acts chapter 6, the apostles, who are the proto-elders, who then ordain elders to carry on ministry for them, they say in Acts chapter 6, verse 4, that it would not be right for them to serve the tables, or to deacon serve the tables there, to take care of the widows in the church. But they say, we'll devote ourselves to, anyone know? What do the elders or the apostles devote themselves to?
Teaching of the word.
Yeah, ministry of the word and prayer. And this is, so if you think about that, that's gospel work. Ministry of the word, proclaiming the gospel, proclaiming the grace of God through a substitutionary atonement, Jesus. Okay, that's what elders do, and they pray for the people as they're shepherding them along. Okay, and so ministry of the word and prayer. If you're a priest your job is, what were we talking about just a minute ago? What do priests do in the tabernacle? Sacrifice. So priests are dealing with substitutionary atonement. They're teaching that lesson to Israel every Sabbath day, or every day, morning and evening with the sacrifice. Every Sabbath day, additional sacrifices. Every new moon, so every 29 days, they're doing that. All these but they're teaching God's people God's grace. Okay? That he doesn't treat his people as their sins deserve, but that he is just and maintains his justice, bringing to death, wages of sin is death, bringing to death somebody for the sin that's been committed. And so priests are doing this gospel ministry in the Old Testament. Again, the work of the tabernacle is not works. It's mercy. It's grace. It's God showing his people day after day, week after week, month after month, that he does not treat his people as their sins deserve. Who's he treat as their sins deserve? The animals. And who becomes, in the New Testament, that one sacrifice that encapsulates all the sacrifices, all the different kinds. That's Jesus. And so the priests are doing that in the Old Testament. They're reminding God's people of God's grace through a substitute atonement offering, which Jesus becomes. And we find out in the New Testament that all the offerings in the Old Testament were shadows, as the writer of Hebrews says, shadows of what Jesus would do. Okay, and so the priests are doing this sacrifice, showing off the mercy of God, showing off the gospel in the Old Testament. The Levites, what else needs to be done besides sacrifices in the tabernacle?
Replacing the bread.
All kinds of stuff needs to be done, and that's what the Levites do. To get your question there. So Levites are doing all the tabernacle and all the temple work that's not sacrifice. That's not going into the holy place. That's not going in with the high priest into the Holy of Holies once per year. That's reserved. The sacrifice work, the burning of incense, anything to do with the holy place is priestly work. The Levites are dumping the ashes from the altar of burnt offering, where the animals have been burnt. The Levites take the ashes and they go take them to a dump heap outside the camp or outside of Jerusalem. The Levites are they're baking the bread for the table of showbread there, the table of the Lord's presence. They're doing all this stuff. See how that correlates to deacons today. So I don't have to set up chairs and have my mind energy on chairs. I can preach to you and have my mind engaged in that. Okay, and so we the elders are praying for you and involved in ministry of word and prayer, which is priestly ministry, and then Levitical ministry, taking care of all the stuff so the priests can do the sacrifices. So gospel ministry, that the mercy of God can be seen, and God's people can be dealt with in mercy and see God's mercy. That's what the elders are focused on. So that's why the apostles say we will devote ourselves to the ministry of the word and prayer. But this is good. And so you should ordain for yourselves 7 men of good reputation, full of the Holy Spirit and of faith, is what they say there. And so they do that. And so they name those 7 men there and ordain those people, lay their hands on them. Okay, so great question there. Levites are doing all the setup, and priests are doing the sacrifices, and anything to do with the holy place or the Holy of Holies. Okay, good. Let's read these things. So it's a book of regulations for sacrifices, priests, and being holy for worship. Here's something that we didn't address quite yet. There are things for the people. What needs to be true of you in the book of Leviticus? What needs to be true of you so that you can enter God's presence to worship?
clean and consecrated?
Yeah, good. That was one question, but you guys answered it. Good. So, great. Yeah, you have to be clean and consecrated. And if you're unclean, you can't come and worship. And so we'll talk about that. All right, our purpose here. Blake, can you read our purpose there, starting with the word God? Okay, good. So Moses is writing this book so people, now that they have the tabernacle, will know all the things that need to be in place, all these regulations of holiness, and he's teaching them, and we'll see this by the end of the book, that their blessing depends upon their compliance to these regulations for worship and holiness and not showing up before the Lord having not been cleansed or purified for worship. Okay. Now, just, so you don't get nervous, how can we come to worship and not get extinguished today?
Jesus.
What?
Through Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, through Jesus. What has he done for us? He's purified us of our sins, hasn't he? Right? And so we don't get extinguished, with our worship. He's cleansed us so that we can come into the presence of God and worship as through the curtain, as the writer of Hebrews will say. Okay, so God's teaching. The book of Leviticus is there, so God's people know they need to follow these regulations, and their blessing or being cursed in the promised land depends on their compliance to these holiness and worship regulations. That's how important worship is. And you don't mess with worship, right? You already know this from Exodus 32 with the golden calf. Yeah.
So with respect to Jesus being the permanent purification for his life, there's obviously been instances where someone who thinks they're a Christian but isn't necessarily a Christian has entered into a church, physical building,
right,
with the body of Christ, the church, Big C, and in quotes worshipped, and they've exited the building and not been struck down.
Yeah. So
what's the protection, or is that just general mercy at that point?
Yeah, it's general mercy. It's gospel era. Right now, and where we see this fulfilled again is when someone enters God's presence and they have not been cleansed by the blood of a substitutionary atonement sacrifice. When is someone extinguished? Because, Bill.
Well, I wouldn't say extinguished, but they're limited with the Lord's Supper. They're not allowed to.
Okay, we did a good example of today how that's applicable today. But when does this happen?
The judgment seat of Christ.
Yes, final judgment. Okay, that's when someone comes before. So Revelation 20, right? Everybody, the sea is emptied of its dead, the grave is emptied of its dead. The souls from hell are emptied out of hell. Hell's thrown into the lake of fire, and the soul's body met. The resurrection. Jesus, John 5:29, 28, and 29. That all will be raised from their graves, and those who have done evil will rise to be judged, to be condemned. Yeah, in Matthew 25, and they'll claim, when did we not do these things for you, right? That's the claim of those who don't understand the mercy of God. They claim their righteousness before him. We've done all these things. Final judgment is this reappearance of Nadab and Abihu. It's this reappearance of cursing when someone approaches God and is not cleansed with an atoning sacrifice. that's when the era of grace is over. And so those who appear before him at the judgment seat of Christ without an atoning sacrifice by faith, by having believed in Jesus, they're, extinguished or cast into the lake of fire forever and ever. Yeah, Matthew.
And so maybe I'm being pedantic, but so is this judgment deferred or judgment for the approach post grace of not being holy? So, like, for what I'm saying is, I know they get judged for all their sins, but I'm speaking specifically to those that like enter into a church, or am I just being too?
So those who enter into a church, it would go in the category of, if they don't believe, they've just stored up wrath for themselves, as Paul talks about in Romans 1.
Lord's Supper.
And with the Lord's Supper, it's one of the reasons before I serve the Lord's Supper, I say, if this is not true of you, that you believe in Jesus and that you're relying upon him and only him for your eternal life, please don't take. Because then they would be approaching, and ingesting, what we've declared, not physically, but spiritually, to be the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. And that's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, that someone brings condemnation upon themselves by taking the Lord's Supper apart from faith, or in an unworthy manner. Yeah, Manny.
Is it an extra condemnation? I mean, obviously we're all condemned prior to Christ.
Yeah, because God is fair. And so the more evil we do, the more justice comes against us. Yeah.
Or Jesus.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, or if we're a believer, the more condemnation we find out had come against Jesus back at the cross 2,000 years ago. Really, it's a good motivation not to sin. It's like, I know this already happened, when you're tempted. I know you already died for all my sins, but I'm not going to sin this time because I don't want to be responsible for adding a little bit more pain to you on that cross. Kind of a funny way to think, but okay. So this is Moses historically. Think Leviticus. Historically, this is Moses showing, here are all the regulations that you need to fulfill. And these aren't hard regulations. These aren't like temptations. These aren't sin nature things. This is just something that an unbeliever could do. You can wear a certain kind of clothing if you're a priest and not regenerate. You can do that, right? Christians and non-Christians can both wear rugby shirts. Doesn't take the Spirit of God in you to wear a rugby shirt. Okay? You can do these certain sacrifices. You can bring the right amount of this or the right amount of that. You can show up 3 times a year, if you're a male in Israel, to Jerusalem to celebrate these festivals. There's no regeneration required in that. So this is not stuff that they had to struggle over doing. This is just bare bones. Work starts at 9:00, and if you're late more than 3 times, you're fired. Anyone can do that, right? And this is all stuff anyone can do. And so God says, do this and do this exactly, or there's trouble. Are we on the same page here? God says. And so it's not like he's not putting down in Leviticus impossible regulations. Okay? And in fact, when there is sin among the people, we'll see this in the holiness regulations for the people in the teens of Leviticus. When there is a sin or somebody's become unclean, God provides this way for people to get clean. And it's done. They wash and that night, and then they're clean, and then they can come and worship. There's no eternal lostness, or you can't come to the temple for 2 months. It's like, no, do this and then wash, and then you're clean that evening. Okay. So here's our outline, and this will what the outline is when you think Leviticus, and you'll see us in the outline points. Think regulations. That's the key word in the book of Revelation, book of Leviticus. And so our outline point 1:1, Chase. Okay, so first part of the book opens up with sin offerings. Boom. Chapter 1, just right there. Sin offerings, and goes through guilt offerings and grain offerings, fellowship offerings, all these kind of offerings. What the first half of that is what the people do, and the people primarily are sacrificing at the tabernacle. The priests act as supervisors, and as those who take the sacrifice and put it on the altar. That's kind of a surprise to us, but the people are the ones who are dressed, who are doing the throat slitting. 8:1, Lily. Okay, so the priests, regulations for them, so their ordination, what they're to be doing, that comes in chapter 8. Next, Elijah, can you read 11:1, that outline point for us?
Yeah, regulations of uncleanness.
Okay, so this is for the people in general, and kind of in life, what's clean and what's unclean. And so, like even Jews today don't eat pork because pig is unclean. And so it's just something you don't eat. Now if a Jew, eats a burrito and, it's a pork burrito and he didn't know it, there's a way to be cleansed of that. So he can go back in the temple. It's not a deathly sin. Yeah, Matt.
My ex-brother-in-law won a barbecue championship.
And he was Jewish, just the context. Yep. So that's 11:1. And then 17:1. Let's see here. John.
Regulations of holy living.
Okay, so things to do just in regular life for holy living, so you can be a worshiping person. And then 26:1, Brenda.
Potential blessings and curses based on the compliance to the regulations.
Okay, so in chapter 26, you're almost at the end of the book. 26 and 27, we're tailing off in the book here. But Leviticus 26 is one of our big lists of blessings and curses. And that gets repeated by Moses. Anyone know where he repeats these? Yeah, Deuteronomy 28. So kind of the end of his second giving of the law. Last legislation he's giving there, Deuteronomy 28. But it's essentially a repeat of what he had written in Leviticus. And Leviticus 26 is a great place to look at blessings and curses. And it's essentially, if you keep me as your God and you worship me as I've proclaimed you should worship me here in this book, you'll experience all these blessings. Anyone think of different kinds of blessings that are mentioned there for promised land blessings?
Fruitfulness in the crops.
Yeah, fruitful crops. So you have abundant crops. Good. Any other things you can think of?
Children.
Yeah, fruitful the womb too. That you'll become numerous, and that was an issue for them. Think when they're there at the end of the 40 years. They still don't have enough people to fill out the land. That's one of the issues when they go in with Joshua. It's like, if you conquer this all right now, you won't be able to, it'll grow weeds and all this stuff. And so that was a big blessing to, have lots of kids. Good. Any other things?
Protection.
Yeah, protection from foreign enemies. Good. So a lot of good things. How about curses?
Enemies coming in and taking over.
Yeah, kind of the reverse of all those things. That enemies will come in, instead of lending to foreign nations, you'll be poor and you'll have to borrow from them. Foreign nations will come in and they'll conquer you. You won't get rain in its season. You won't have abundant crops. God is sovereign over all these things. And he's saying the key to this is just keep me as your God. That's it. It's not perfect obedience. It's keep me as your God and do these Levitical, book of Leviticus. Remind yourselves that you're under my mercy and be thankful for that. That's what Leviticus is about. Reminding yourselves of my mercy. And so the priests, there was a morning and evening sacrifice every day. All 7 days, morning and evening sacrifice. And that smoke was going up. And so anyone there could smell that, right? It's Burger King, right? You go by Burger King and go, Man, that smells good. Or some kind of steakhouse or a barbecue place, right? You're like, wow. But this was a reminder, God, to his people in the Old Testament, of his mercy. Day after day, morning sacrifice, evening sacrifice. And then they did that on the Sabbath day too, the morning sacrifice and the evening sacrifice. But they also added a Sabbath sacrifice to that in addition. And then at the end of the new moon, as it's called, so the Jewish calendar was according to full moon to full moon. Okay, and so that's about 29 days. So the way they sorted it out is they had 12 months, but every once in a while they had a 13th month. And that was their leap month. They had a leap month every so many years. But then they would have an additional sacrifice on the new moon. So they could have a daily morning and evening sacrifice, a Sabbath sacrifice, and a new moon sacrifice all on the same day. And then they had additional sacrifices with various feasts and festivals, that kind of thing. Manny.
Maybe you'll address this later, but so each of these sacrifices, you said something earlier, how all the sacrifices, were shadows of Christ.
Yeah.
Right? Do they convey in specific ways? Because there's a bunch of them. I've just finished Leviticus, and I was like, what do each of these sacrifices, do they represent different things?
Or different aspects. They do. Just in short, burnt offering, it's the whole animal, that no one gets anything from it. It's all burned up to God, and it's the idea of whole life devotion. I owe everything to you, God. Sin offering for sins you'd committed. Guilt offering was for violations of worship, or if you did something against somebody where you could offer them recompense. So if you stole his thing and on the way of giving it back to him because you had contrition, you broke it, you would have a guilt offering, and you would pay the person back, but you'd have to guilt offering too. Grain offering was the idea of a reminder of thankfulness for God for his provision. Sometimes those are called fellowship, a thank offering there. And then there are fellowship offerings, which were more celebratory. And the fellowship offering that was given, the bringer of the sacrifice, he would get almost all the offering back to eat for him and his family. And they would celebrate and have fellowship. And that's why it's also called a peace offering. Depends on what Bible translation you're in. But the fellowship offering was that idea. They all have little nuances. All of them have some aspect of atonement. But especially sin, guilt, and whole offering have big atonement aspects to them. Yeah, a good question. We'll hit this last outline point, and then we'll break for worship. So last outline point, last thing in the book of Leviticus. Mallory, can you read this for us?
Regulations of vows.
Yeah, so you got a big list of how do you make a vow? How do you fulfill a vow? What do you do at the end of a vow? So we'll talk about that. One of the things like Jehovah's Witnesses has said you can't take any vows, right? So they don't do Pledge of Allegiance, that kind of thing. And it's based on Jesus saying, in the Sermon on the Mount, talking about vows. The problem there is context. What was going on during Jesus' day is the Pharisees found a clever way to lie. It was to swear by the gold of the temple. And Jesus, but you were supposed to take a vow swearing by the Lord. It was an oath to the Lord. So an oath is saying, this is true. And if God were here, he would say the same thing that I'm saying. As far as I know, with all the knowledge I have about this event, I'm under oath. I'm saying, this is what I saw. This is what happened. And you're just, you want your, Jesus said, and James said, your yes to be yes and your no to be no. But there are occasions where it's so important, you need to verify, I'm not kidding around here. Right? Little Joe Biden there. Not kidding around, folks. No joke. That's his little knock phrase there. But so there are occasions for that, like court situations, and in Israel that was true. A vow is an oath that promises to do something. So you vow to do something. I will do this, and I swear by the Lord I'll do this for you. So marriage vow. You're not just saying this marriage is true, but you're doing this. You're making this vow, and it's a vow to the Lord. And of course vows get broken, and Leviticus takes care of that too. What do you do, and how do you go about with a broken vow? So nobody's lost, with a broken vow. But the regulations for all this kind of stuff are given in chapter 27. Okay, so let's stop there, and we'll pick up next week and finish off Leviticus. But let's pray.